Scripture tonight, Proverbs 16 and Proverbs 8. What I was telling was tonight, it's time to come to church for me to go in and get ready and head this way. And I looked at the field, and I looked at the tractor, and I looked at the field, and I looked at the tractor, and I said, I think I'll call Brother Philip. And I said it myself. No, trust me, I can talk all day long and nobody hear me in the tractor. So anyway, I said tonight would be a good night to call Brother Philip. Explain to him what's going on. And I said, but just as sure as I make that phone call, the hay baler's going to fly all to pieces. And I said, Lord, I'm not going to do that. And I kept running. I said, but I'm not going to call him. I said, but I'm going to run a little while, but I'm not going to call him. And just as sure as I said that, guess what happened? Hay baler popped the chain. And I said, Choop, right on round, pulled right under the shelter. I said, Lord, I know what it is. If you'll help me, I'll fix it tomorrow. But right now, we're cutting this thing off. I got the message. But I said all along I wasn't going to do it. But anyway, isn't it amazing? I wanted to do that, but I knew I needed to be here, and I wanted to be here. And so, it's a no-brainer, is it? It'll be there tomorrow, won't it? Y'all going to help me tomorrow, right? In case y'all online, they really backed up on that last one there. Anyway, but Proverbs 16 and Proverbs 8. All right, to introduce the message tonight, I need your help. And that is occupational hazards. Occupational hazards. If I were, when I think of a hockey player, and yes, I've been watching the playoffs with the Carolina Hurricanes. I could care less about hockey, but for whatever reason, the Carolina Hurricanes are in playoffs. I want to watch it. But what do you think is a hazard, an occupational hazard for a hockey player? Lose your teeth. That's exactly what I thought of. Naturally, it comes with some things. But listen, have you ever noticed on the ice, a hockey player, he can skate forward and he can skate backwards. And it's just like they're gliding like a duck across water. I could not do that. I'm just here to tell you. Put me on ice skates, and I'd lock my legs together, and you could push me, and I would never move. I'd stay just like this right here, and I'd go just like that. But if you push me backwards like that, it's just something about, I've never done that. But when you think of a hockey player, naturally you think of some of the dangers. Okay. Name another occupation that you think of some hazards with. What now? A lineman. Very true. Off the ground, electricity, storms, the workload from that. Name another. Construction. With that, again, you hear of construction accidents and the safety aspect of it, moving things off the ground, whatever it may be. What are some others? All right, wait a minute. A tow truck driver, the news just recently, one killed, died, involving a bus that they'd gone to pick up. You mentioned farmer, and I'll come back to that one. Another one, firefighter. Very good. Jeff, firefighter, number of years, occupational hazards for a firefighter. They did a series of investigation and tests and whatnot. Cancer runs high with that. What do you think is another occupational hazard for a firefighter besides cancer? Okay, the smoke, the actual going to a fire. Believe it or not, heart attack ranks right up there. All of a sudden, you're in a relaxed mode and called. It's just the the jolt back and forth. You know, the emotions, the um, whatever in your body just engages with that. Several with that. What's another occupational when you think of hazards? Police officer. Today is a day and time in society that the aspect of a law enforcement officer, it is a very, very dangerous profession with that. All right? Somebody else mentioned one. Car racing. Car racing. Watched a race one time and the car went, I mean, it was a bad wreck. I normally don't watch a lot of racing, but I saw one and and I'm like, watched it and I'm like, he'll never race again. About a month later, he was back in the car, and that floored me with that. All right. Anybody else? Logging. That is true. Farming, you mentioned. It's one of the most dangerous professions there is. Why in the world would you think of farming have dangers associated with it? The equipment, the moving aspect of it, the uncertainty of it, the always changing. It's not a consistent pattern with that. A fella in Burlington, I believe it was, had a bull, pet bull, whatever. He'd raised him down on the farm. Bull turned on him, and now it's a GoFundMe page to help with expenses for that. With that, so you have the livestock aspect. All of it. Now think about the Christian life. Christianity was our occupation. What are some of the hazards for being a Christian? Persecution. Who in Scripture do you think probably understood a lot of the hazards for Christianity? And he was a great leader. Paul. As a matter of fact, some of the things we're going to talk about come by means of Paul, in that the hazard of it all. He was a great spiritual leader. He'd been used greatly by God. He realized that there were some hazards that he must escape himself as he continued to be used by God. As a matter of fact, every Christian is a leader in some respect. If you had to assign one word for someone who was a leader, just one word, what would it be? One word to describe, not to describe the actions of a leader, but what a leader does. One word. Confident. Influence. Every leader, there's an aspect of influence. And I think of Paul, that's what I think of. It is very exciting to be a child of God and to be used of God to do His work. I'll say that again. It is very exciting to be a child of God and to be used of God to do His work. However, it's also frightening in a sense to be used of God and to think that you would reach a place where God wouldn't use you. To be used of God and then all of a sudden get to a place where God doesn't use you. I remember a man by the name of Jim Bandy who worked with the youth at the church that I was going to growing up. And he always said, my greatest concern in prayer and life is not to be a dokimos. Of course, when you're in junior high or high school when somebody uses the word dokimos, and you're like, where's that word come from? And then he explains it as to what it means and where it was found at in Scripture and all this aspect. But it means to be put up on a shelf. No longer for service for God. And so Paul had a great concern for that. If you're a blessed Christian, and we are, some of the hazards in life. Number one is pride. Pride. We're going to come to Proverbs 16:18 first. Proverbs 16:18. We'll see where pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. We're only an instrument for the Lord. But think about this. Those that have been involved in some capacity in serving the Lord were God blessed, and they took pride to a different level and said, look what I've done. Paul, I believe, knew a little bit about pride. Paul said this, for I am the least of the apostles, that am not meet to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. From 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9, verse 10. Paul, I believe, had experienced truly an exciting time with God blessing him. But Paul is not one that ever stood up and said, look what I've done. He always pointed others to Christ. He didn't take the credit for himself. Think with me. In your lifetime, my lifetime, think of those leaders in the Christian circle. Pride took them down. Pride is a hazard for all of us if we're not careful. And I'm truly amazed. And I think of Paul. Folks, I'll be honest with you. When I get to heaven, I'm looking forward to seeing Jesus. Don't get me wrong. I'm not putting Paul above him. I would never do that. But I want to see Paul too. There are a lot of folks I'd like to see in heaven. I'd like to see you in heaven. You know? But when I think of Paul, I think it's going to be a long line behind Paul to say, hey, Paul, tell me about this. But Paul doesn't take the credit and say, look what I've done. The pride aspect. The second thing is the popularity. Praise is sometimes a greater hindrance to a spiritual leader than criticism. When somebody sings the praises and talks about how good, and it ties into pride. The spiritual leader must be careful not to allow the personality of worship. And Preacher Walser from Grace Baptist Church in Lewisburg was very good at this. I thought the world of him. I mean, I just did. Still do. But he was a very humble man. And he would always point. He said, it's not me, it's of the Lord. It's not me, it's of the Lord. Aspect of it. He'd always point people to Christ. Paul said this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers by whom you believe? Even as the Lord gave you to every man, I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. I think of churches that have grown a lot under some pastor's ministry. And nothing wrong with that. I think that's a great thing. But it wasn't long before that church got bigger than they were. If you understand what I mean. And the church would look to that individual, and they put that individual on a pedestal in that sense. I believe that's an occupational hazard. When you become too popular for your britches. In other words, too big for your britches. You've heard that saying, I'm sure, with that. And I remember growing up, that was old saying with it. too big for your britches. And my first thought was, when I first heard it, was that's real easy. Just get me bigger britches, you know. But that's not exactly what that was meant about with that. Uh, anyway, John the Baptist said this. He, speaking of Jesus, must increase, but I must decrease. Popularity is a hazard. Pride, popularity. Lust is a hazard. It's an occupational hazard, and it's caused the death of many that have served the Lord. You have the lust of flesh. You have the lust of the eyes. The lust of the flesh, I believe, deals with the sexual aspect of it. Lust of the eyes deal with covetousness. Have caused many to fall. I remember it down at Newport, working on the church, and one Friday afternoon, I was up there doing something, and down 70 Highway, all you saw was a boat being pulled by a vehicle going right by. Choo, choo, choo. I thought to myself, man, you know, it'd be nice to be able to go get on a boat. Sunday morning, boats. I thought about putting a sign up out there on 70 Highway and said, you turn, or turn right here, for, you know, something like that. But it didn't work. But wanting what somebody else has caused a lot of Christians to be defeated. I believe it's a hazard. Not just for the Christian, but for others. The whole aspect of it. Folks, think back in your lifetime. Think back of men who were in a strong leadership position. Maybe a pastor of a church who's fell into that trap. There was a man, we used to go to Monroe, North Carolina. They had a pastor's fellowship. It was always right after Good Friday, right in that time frame. And it was a real lively service. I enjoyed it. I did. One of the moderator, it was at Bobby Leonard's church on Walkup Avenue in Monroe, North Carolina, Tabernacle Baptist Church. And he was the pastor of the church, but he had another pastor always moderate the service. That way nobody could get mad at him on who was called to preach and who wasn't called to preach. It was always somebody else. There was a man there named Jack Story. Jack Story. And I remember the first time I went up there, and he was talking, and how and I thought he had a strong following. He really did. The next year he wasn't back. What happened? The lust of the flesh. A lot of folks have fallen. It's a hazard. It's a hazard. Plain as I know how to put it, and that is this. If it doesn't belong to you, leave it alone. If it doesn't belong to you. The Bible speaks of a strange woman. Now, that's not some weirdo lady. The strange woman is the woman that doesn't belong to you. And some of you might think you're married and your wife is strange. But that's not what it's talking about. All right, you have the pride, the popularity, the lust aspect. The fourth thing is an odd one. The fourth thing is the yo-yo emotion. It's a danger. It's a hazard for the Christian. What does the yo-yo emotion? What does a yo-yo do? Hey, wait, let me back up. How many of you know what a yo-yo is? How many have ever somehow, some way, whatever, have played with a yo-yo? How many would you would say you were pretty good with a yo-yo? All right, I could see TJ. You remember you take that yo-yo and they made a what they call a butterfly yo-yo. Yeah, you could throw it down like that right there, and it'd get down to the slowest point and spin the spinner, and then they would do all these other little tricks and do this and rock it around the world and all. The Yo-Yo Man. How many of you ever seen the Yo-Yo Man? The video, the Yo-Yo Man. He's good. He's good. But most of the time when you throw a yo-yo down, what happens? It comes back up. That's the yo-yo. Up and down, up and down. That's a hazard for a Christian. Up and down, up and down. In other words, today, you're doing pretty good. But tomorrow the bottom falls out. And people get tired of the roller coaster ride. And, you know, it's a hazard. Not just for the Christian, it's a hazard in life. So how do you deal with that? Well, what did Paul say? He said this in Philippians. For I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. Philippians 4 verse 11. Paul said, I'm content. I actually used that verse when Camille got married. Let me tell you why. Everybody in the church was talking about, oh, you're not losing a daughter, you're gaining a son-in-law. Y'all heard that before? You're not losing a daughter, you're gaining a son-in-law? And I simply said, my Bible says, be content with what you got. I thought it was a pretty good answer. No, I was just joking with that an aspect of it. But, you know, Paul said, look, be satisfied. Hey, folks, success comes. Failures come. It's an up and down ride. But listen, success doesn't last forever. Failure doesn't last forever. It's up and down. It's a temporary thing in this life. The yo-yo, the up and down, the up and down, the up and down. That's a hazard for Christians. One day you're just all 100% on top of a mountain. But for every mountain, there's two valleys. And then I heard this. Yeah, but preacher, for every valley, there's two mountains. One on. I can't argue with that. And then the fifth occupational hazard is a sense of being indispensable. I read some things about this, and isn't it a shame when a Christian gets to the point when they say, God can't do without me? How can I explain that? Well, it's real simple. The workman is buried, but the work goes on. The workman is buried, but the work goes on. Folks, we ought to live as if God depends upon us. But the truth is this: you're not irreplaceable. You're not. And if you think God can't do it without you, you got it wrong, because you can't do it without God. You can't do it without God. Paul said this, be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. From 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1. Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. By the way, we're just an instrument that God uses. And God changes instruments as He desires. occupational hazards of Christianity. We know that the devil is behind them, but I also remind you that Satan himself, he's a sneak. He slides around, slides right in, misleads, misguides, lies. You could put the whole list on it. But he makes it look good when it's so wrong. Thank you for joining us at Riverside Baptist Church in Kenly, North Carolina on a Wednesday night, dealing with the occupational hazards, if you will, being a leader or in Christianity.